I'd never been more thankful for having a stalker than the night he saved my life. I used to have a big social media presence, and I loved it. Except one of my followers took things too far. He found my address and started physically camping outside my house, knocking on the door, peeking in through the windows, testing the knob to see if it'd open. I couldn't go outside on my own without worrying he'd be there. So I moved. Away from the city, away from social media, away from the stalker. The neighborhood I chose was from a small, quiet town where everyone was friendly. Exactly what I needed. But there was this one guy there named Finn, who for some reason gave me the creeps. I thought maybe it was just my imagination. I mean, other than his creepy stare, he was really sweet. He'd come by offering to help with yard work when he saw me struggling, even fixed up my sink and washing machine. But soon he started showing up at my door with little gifts. Flowers, homemade cookies. Then he started showing up just to ask me out for coffee or dates to the bar. He got my number from the neighborhood directory and started sending me texts in the middle of the night asking, "Are you awake? Just thinking about you. Why won't you give me a chance?" And the more I ignored them, the more intense the texts got. "Are you single? Have you been with anyone since you've moved?" I blocked his number, but somehow he got a new one and kept texting. That's when the letters started appearing in my mailbox. Handwritten notes saying things like, "You can't ignore me forever," and "I know you feel this connection too." My heart raced every time I found one. But then my literal clothes started going missing from my laundry room. Underwear mostly. Still, I'd had enough. I marched over to Finn's house that afternoon and started pounding on his door. The other neighbors who were out mowing their lawns started walking over while I yelled, "Stop texting me! Stop leaving notes! And stay away from my house!" Finn opened the door and looked genuinely confused. "Whoa, slow down! Texts? Notes? What are you talking about?" he asked. I almost laughed. "Oh, don't think that's going to work on me for 1 second. You've been acting creepy since I got here." He sighed. "I'm sorry if I came across that way to you, but it's not what it seems." He began explaining how the gifts were from the other neighbors, that he was only the delivery man, and the part about asking me on dates was just to hang out so he could introduce me to other people in town. "Oh? And stealing my underwear also wasn't you?" I shouted. "Honey, Finn's been out of town all week visiting his sister. He just got back an hour ago," one of the old neighbors pointed out. I felt my face get hot, but I didn't back down. Then explain the texts and the letters. Finn pulled out his phone and showed everyone his recent messages. Nothing to me. Nothing remotely suspicious. I walked back to my house humiliated, but I wasn't giving up. I set up hidden cameras pointing directly at Finn's house, sure that I'd catch him slipping those creepy notes under my front door, or maybe even stealing an underwear or two. But something else happened. I woke up at 3 in the morning to the sound of someone walking around my house. The floorboards creaked with every step. My heart raced as I sat up, watching a human's shadow moving down the hallway, slowly getting closer to my door. My heart was pounding so loud I thought whoever it was could hear it. I grabbed my phone and pressed record just as a man stepped into my doorway. The man noticed I was awake and immediately lunged at me. I screamed and tried to fight him off, but he was so much stronger. He placed his hand over my mouth and started dragging me toward the door. I bit down hard on his finger, just enough that he yelled and took a step back away from me. That's when my front door burst open and Finn came running in. That's when I froze. "Finn!" I gasped. Then, "Who is this?" He tackled the guy to the ground and yelled at me to get out and get help. In a panic, I grabbed a lamp and hit the intruder over the head. Finn quickly picked me up in his arms and carried me outside to safety while our neighbors gathered around and called the police. We sat on the front porch of Finn's house, staring at my house from across the street, surrounded by sirens. "Thank you," I told Finn. "I'm so sorry I accused you. I was so sure it was you." He smiled and patted my shoulder. "It's okay. I get it. You've been through a lot." The police called me an hour later with an update. My stalker had confessed to breaking in and kidnap attempt, but when they asked about the texts and letters and missing clothes, he looked confused. Those might be from someone else. Finn reached over and quickly disconnected the call. He placed his arm over my shoulder and leaned down close to my ear. "Whoops. You weren't supposed to learn about that just yet." I tried to pull away, but his arm got tighter around my shoulders. His fingers dug into my upper arm hard enough to hurt. My phone was still in my hand from when he disconnected the call, and I realized something. The police had been on the line when Finn said that. They heard him confess. My whole body went stiff as I forced myself to stay calm, even though everything in me wanted to run. Finn leaned closer and his breath was warm against my ear. His voice dropped low so only I could hear. "We should go inside my house and talk about this privately," he said. There was an edge to his voice now that made my skin crawl. I shook my head fast and pulled harder against his grip. "I'd rather stay out here where everyone can see us," I told him. My voice came out shaky, but I didn't care. I looked across the street and saw Lucy standing on her porch watching us. She had her phone in her hand. Finn noticed me looking at her and his smile got tighter. His whole face changed in a way that made him look like a stranger. "Come on, let's just go inside for a minute," he said again. His fingers squeezed harder on my arm. "I'm not going anywhere with you," I said louder. Lucy took a step forward on her porch. Then I heard the most beautiful sound. Sirens. Multiple sirens getting closer fast. Finn heard them too because his whole body went rigid. Red and blue lights came around the corner and 2 patrol cars pulled up in front of my house. A woman got out of the first car, and I'd never been so happy to see a police uniform in my life. Finn immediately dropped his arm from around me and stepped back. His face switched back to that concerned neighbor look like flipping a switch. The woman detective walked straight toward us, and I stood up so fast I almost tripped. "He just confessed," I blurted out. "The texts and the letters and stealing my clothes. It was him. He just told me." The detective's face got hard, and she looked at Finn in a way that made it clear she'd heard everything. "I'm Detective Savannah Mills," she said. "Nobody move." Another officer got out of the second patrol car, and Savannah pointed at me, then at Finn. "Clifford, separate them," she said. The male officer named Clifford walked over to Finn while Savannah took my arm gently and led me to her patrol car. I was shaking so hard my teeth were chattering. "Sit here," she said, and opened the back door for me. I sat on the edge of the seat with my feet still on the ground. She pulled out her phone and hit record. "Tell me everything," she said. So I did. I explained about the months of texts from 2 different numbers asking why I wouldn't give him a chance. The letters in my mailbox saying I couldn't ignore him forever. My missing underwear from the laundry room. The way he'd show up at my door with gifts and asking me out. Then tonight, after Fletcher got arrested and the police called about the texts and letters, Finn grabbed my phone and hung up. He put his arm around me and whispered that I wasn't supposed to learn about that yet. Savannah's eyes never left my face as she recorded every word. "Do you have any of this evidence saved?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "Everything." I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and showed her the screenshots. Both phone numbers with all the texts. I have photos of every letter he left too. And I made a list of everything that went missing with the dates I noticed. Savannah looked impressed. "This documentation makes my job much easier," she said. "Are you willing to let forensics search your house for evidence? Both from Fletcher Dillon and from anywhere Finn might have accessed?" "Yes," I said immediately. "Search everything." Across the street I could see Finn talking to Clifford. He was moving his hands a lot and pointing at my house like he was explaining something totally reasonable. Kevin had come over now, and so had Lucy and several other neighbors who'd heard the sirens. They all stood in a group looking confused and worried. I could see them trying to figure out what was happening. Why the police were separating me and Finn. Savannah asked me to start from the very beginning. So I told her about my social media presence in the city, and how Fletcher had found my address, how he'd camp outside my house and peek in windows and test the door, how I'd moved here to escape him and feel safe again. Then I described how Finn seemed helpful at first, fixing my sink and washing machine and offering to help with yard work, but the gifts felt wrong and the attention was too much. Then the text started in the middle of the night. She took notes and asked specific questions about timing. When did the text start compared to when you moved in? How often did the letters appear? What exactly did they say? I answered everything as clearly as I could, even though my brain felt foggy from shock. Clifford walked Finn over and Savannah stood up straight. "Mr. Finn, you're being detained for questioning regarding stalking and harassment charges," she said. Finn's friendly mask cracked right down the middle. "This is a misunderstanding," he said fast. His voice got louder. "She's confused because of her past trauma. She's been through so much with that other guy that she's seeing threats where there aren't any." I heard Lucy gasp behind us. Kevin's face changed as he started to understand what was really happening. "I was just trying to be a good neighbor," Finn kept talking. "The gifts were from everyone. I was helping her meet people. She's taking normal, friendly behavior and twisting it into something it's not because she's traumatized." Savannah held up her hand. "I need you to explain something," she said. Her voice was calm but sharp. "This woman reported that after the police called tonight, you disconnected the call and said, quote, 'You weren't supposed to learn about that just yet.' What were you referring to?" Finn's face went completely blank for a second. It was like watching someone's computer crash. Then he tried to smile. "I was joking," he said. "I was talking about a neighborhood welcome party we were planning. It was supposed to be a surprise." Nobody looked convinced, especially not Savannah. A white van pulled up and 3 people in forensics gear got out. Savannah walked over to them and I heard her giving instructions. They headed toward my house with their equipment cases. "You have my permission," I called out. "Search everything." They nodded and went inside. I gave them my keys and watched them disappear through my front door. 20 minutes later, one of the forensics team came back out. "Detective Mills," she called. "We found scratches on the back door lock. Fresh ones. Looks like someone's been practicing picking it." My stomach dropped so hard I thought I might throw up. Finn had been inside my house when I wasn't home. He'd been in there touching my things, and I never knew. Savannah turned to me and asked if she could see my phone to document everything. I unlocked it with shaking hands and pulled up the text messages from both numbers Finn had used. She took out her own phone and started photographing each message, scrolling slowly through months of increasingly intense texts. The first one seemed almost normal, just asking if I wanted to grab coffee or meet some neighbors. But then they got weird, asking why I wouldn't give him a chance and if I was dating anyone. One message from 3 weeks ago said, "I know what you need better than you do," and I watched Savannah's jaw get tight as she read it. She photographed that one twice, zooming in to capture the timestamp and number. Another message said, "You can't hide from this connection forever," and my stomach twisted remembering how scared I'd been reading these alone at night. Savannah asked if I'd saved the letters too, and I told her they were in a folder in my kitchen drawer. She sent one of the other officers to get them while she finished documenting the texts. The whole time, Finn stood by the other patrol car with Clifford, watching us. His friendly neighbor act was completely gone now, and his face looked blank and cold. Clifford walked over with Finn's phone and asked him to unlock it. Finn hesitated but then did it, probably thinking he'd deleted anything bad. Clifford started scrolling and his expression changed fast. He called Savannah over and showed her the screen. She looked at it for a long moment and then looked at Finn with disgust. They found drafts of messages he never sent, stuff that was way worse than what he actually texted me. One described watching me through my windows at night when I was getting ready for bed. Another one detailed my entire daily routine down to what time I made coffee in the morning and when I usually did laundry. There was even one about how he'd practiced picking my back door lock for weeks before he felt confident enough to actually go inside. Finn's face went red and he started yelling that he wanted a lawyer right now. Clifford told him to calm down and that he'd get his phone call at the station. Savannah kept scrolling through the drafts and I could see her taking screenshots of everything. She showed me one that said, "Soon she'll understand we're meant to be together, and she'll thank me for being patient." And I felt sick reading his words. The forensics team came back out of my house carrying evidence bags and one of them walked straight to Finn's property. Savannah told me they had a warrant to search his garage based on my report about the missing underwear. We all stood there watching as they went inside with their flashlights and equipment. It only took about 10 minutes before one of them came out holding a plastic bag. Inside were several pairs of my underwear, ones I'd thought I lost in the wash or misplaced somehow. But worse than that, the bag had dates written on it in Finn's handwriting. Each date matched up with when I'd noticed items missing from my laundry room. He'd been keeping trophies and cataloging them like some kind of collection. The forensics tech explained that the dates proved this was ongoing theft over months, not just one incident. I felt so violated knowing he'd been in my house taking my things and documenting it all. Lucy gasped from where she stood with the other neighbors and covered her mouth with her hand. Lucy walked over to me with tears running down her face. She grabbed my hands and started apologizing for defending Finn during that confrontation weeks ago when I'd accused him in front of everyone. She said he always seemed like such a helpful young man, and she never suspected anything was wrong. Her voice cracked as she talked about how she'd made me feel crazy for being suspicious. I told her it wasn't her fault and that Finn had fooled everyone, not just her. That was the whole point of how he acted, being the perfect helpful neighbor so nobody would believe me if I complained. Lucy squeezed my hands tighter and promised she'd never doubt me again. Kevin walked over too and put his hand on my shoulder, saying he was sorry for not taking my concerns seriously. He mentioned that old comment about Finn being out of town and how stupid he felt now knowing what was really happening. I appreciated them apologizing, but honestly I just wanted this whole nightmare to be over. Savannah came back over and explained they were arresting Finn on multiple charges. She listed them off: stalking, harassment, burglary, and theft. She said the evidence was strong enough that the prosecutor would likely file formal charges within 24 hours. 2 officers walked Finn to the patrol car and put handcuffs on him. He didn't fight or argue anymore, just stared at me with this intense look that made my skin crawl. They put him in the back seat and I watched through the window as he kept staring. All the neighbors were standing around watching too, their faces showing shock and confusion. Mrs. Kirk from 2 houses down had her hand over her heart. The Juarez family stood together on their lawn looking stunned. Nobody could believe that Finn, the guy who helped everyone with yard work and fix things, had been stalking me this whole time. Kevin approached Savannah and started telling her about conversations he'd had with Finn over the past months. He said Finn asked him lots of questions about me, like when I worked and if I had family visiting and whether I was dating anyone. Kevin thought Finn was just being friendly and making conversation since I was new to the neighborhood. But now he realized Finn was gathering information about my schedule and my life. Savannah wrote everything down in her notebook, nodding as Kevin talked. She asked him specific questions about timing and what exactly Finn had asked. Kevin remembered Finn asking about my car and what time I usually left for work in the mornings. He'd also asked if Kevin ever saw me having visitors or going out with anyone. Savannah said this showed premeditation and planning, that Finn was deliberately collecting intelligence about me. She added it all to her notes as evidence of how calculated his stalking had been. Savannah got a call on her radio and stepped away to answer it. When she came back, she told me they'd finished processing Fletcher at the station. He was charged with breaking and entering, assault, and attempted kidnapping. But she said they'd found something else on his phone that I needed to know about. Fletcher had been tracking my location for months after I moved from the city. He had photos of my new house and neighborhood taken from different angles over several weeks. Some photos were taken at night, some during the day, showing he'd been watching me for a long time before he broke in. Savannah explained he must have used some kind of tracking software or followed me when I left town for errands. The photos were dated and time-stamped, creating a clear record of his stalking behavior. She said this evidence would make his case even stronger for the prosecutor. Savannah told me I needed to come to the police station to give a formal statement about both stalkers. The reality hit me hard that I had 2 separate people who'd been obsessing over me and invading my life. My hands started shaking again and I felt dizzy thinking about it. How did this happen? How did I end up with 2 different stalkers at the same time? Savannah noticed I was struggling and called over a woman I hadn't met yet. She introduced her as a victim advocate who would help me through the legal process. The advocate had kind eyes and spoke softly, explaining that I'd need to get restraining orders against both men. She said we'd also need to make a safety plan since both of them knew where I lived. The advocate asked if I had family or friends I could stay with for a while, and I shook my head. I'd moved here to get away from everyone, to start fresh and be safe. Now I had nowhere to go. At the police station, I sat in a small room with Savannah and the victim advocate. A prosecutor came in and introduced himself, then explained they were treating these as two completely separate cases. Fletcher and Finn didn't know each other and hadn't coordinated their actions at all. It was just horrible luck that I'd escaped one stalker only to attract another one. The prosecutor said Fletcher's case was more straightforward since they caught him in the act of breaking in and attacking me. But Finn's case involved months of calculated stalking behavior that would take more time to build. He told me both men were being held without bail because they were considered flight risks and dangerous to me. That made me feel a little safer, but not much. The prosecutor asked me detailed questions about everything, making me relive months of fear and violation. I told him about the texts and letters and missing clothes and how nobody believed me at first. Savannah explained they were sending the letters I'd received to a handwriting expert to confirm they matched Finn's writing. They were also checking if any fingerprints on the letters matched the prints they'd lifted from my back door lock. The forensics team had found tool marks on the lock showing someone had been practicing picking it. Probably Finn learning how to get into my house without breaking anything. She said all this evidence together would prove Finn had been systematically stalking me and planning his access to my home. The prosecutor nodded and made notes, saying this level of planning showed how dangerous Finn actually was despite his friendly neighbor act. I sat there listening to them discuss my life like it was a case file, which I guess it was now. Everything I'd been through, all the fear and paranoia and sleepless nights, was now just evidence and testimony and legal proceedings. The victim advocate gave me a card for a therapist named Esther Bourgeois, who worked with stalking victims. I called her that afternoon and she had an opening the next day. Her office was in a small building downtown with plants in the windows and soft lighting that made it feel safe. Esther was maybe 50 with kind eyes, and she didn't make me go through the whole story again since she'd already read the police report. Instead, she asked me about the confrontation with Finn weeks ago when the neighbors defended him. I told her how stupid I felt afterward, how humiliated I was when everyone thought I was crazy. She nodded and wrote something down. Then she said something that made me sit up straighter. My instincts weren't wrong about Finn. I picked up on something off about him even when he was acting helpful and friendly. The problem wasn't my gut feeling. The problem was I stopped trusting myself when other people didn't see what I saw. She explained that after trauma, people often swing between two extremes. Either they see danger everywhere, or they doubt themselves so much they ignore real threats. Learning to trust my instincts while managing the hypervigilance would be important work. I left her office feeling lighter somehow, like maybe I wasn't as broken as I thought. Kevin called me that evening and said he and Lucy wanted to organize a neighborhood meeting. They felt terrible about how things went down and wanted everyone to hear the truth and offer support. I wasn't sure I wanted to face all those people again, but Kevin insisted it would help. The meeting was 2 days later in Lucy's backyard. About 15 neighbors showed up, including the ones who'd watched me yell at Finn that day. Lucy stood up first and apologized for defending Finn without listening to my concerns. Her voice shook as she talked about how she'd known him for 3 years and never suspected anything. Kevin spoke next, saying he should have paid more attention when Finn asked all those questions about me. One by one, other neighbors apologized for not taking me seriously. A younger couple I'd never really talked to offered to help with yard work or anything else I needed. Lucy said she'd be watching my house from now on and would call police immediately if she saw anything suspicious. By the end, I was crying and several neighbors hugged me. It felt good to be believed finally, even though it took 2 arrests for people to listen. The next morning, a locksmith arrived to upgrade my locks. Kevin showed up right behind him and offered to help with the installation. They spent hours putting in high-security deadbolts on every door and installing a complete security system with cameras covering every entrance. The locksmith showed me how to use the app on my phone to check the cameras anytime. Kevin refused to let me pay him for his time. He said it was the least he could do after not recognizing the danger I was in. I thanked him, but inside I felt sad that I needed all this just to feel safe in my own home. The cameras and locks were necessary, but they were also a constant reminder of what happened. Every time I armed the system or checked the camera feed, I'd be thinking about Finn and Fletcher and everything they took from me. 3 weeks later, Savannah called with an update on the forensics. The handwriting analysis confirmed Finn wrote all the letters. His fingerprints were on several of them, plus on my back door where he'd been practicing with the lock. She said this evidence combined with the stolen underwear and text messages made for a very strong stalking case. The prosecutor was confident about getting a conviction even if it went to trial. I felt validated hearing this. All those weeks of being told I was paranoid and seeing danger where there wasn't any, and I'd been right the whole time. Finn had been stalking me systematically while playing the helpful neighbor. Savannah said they were building an even stronger case by documenting his pattern of behavior and the planning involved. The scratches on my lock showed premeditation. The dated bag of stolen items showed he was keeping trophies. Everything pointed to someone dangerous and obsessive. A few days after that, the prosecutor called to tell me Fletcher's lawyer wanted to discuss a plea deal. They were offering to plead guilty to lesser charges in exchange for a shorter sentence. The prosecutor asked what I wanted to do. I didn't even hesitate. I told them I wanted Fletcher to face full consequences for tracking me across state lines and breaking into my home. He'd terrorized me for months in the city and then found me here and attacked me. A plea deal felt like letting him off easy. Savannah called me after she heard my decision and said she supported it completely. Fletcher's case was strong enough that they didn't need to offer any deals. The evidence of his months-long tracking and the actual break-in and assault made conviction almost certain. His trial date was set for 3 months out. Then Finn's lawyer reached out about a plea too. He was offering to accept guilt on stalking, burglary, and theft charges in exchange for a shorter sentence. The prosecutor explained the options carefully. If we went to trial, Finn might get more time, but I'd have to testify and face cross-examination. If we accepted the plea, he'd definitely be convicted and registered as a sex offender, but the sentence would be lighter. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to avoid testifying and reliving everything in court. Another part wanted everyone to hear in detail what he did to me. I called Esther and we talked through it for over an hour. She asked me to think about what would support my healing versus what was about punishment. Did I need to see him get the maximum sentence? Or did I need to protect myself from the trauma of a trial? She didn't tell me what to decide, but helped me think through the real costs and benefits of each option. After a week of thinking about it, I decided to accept Finn's plea deal. The guaranteed conviction mattered more to me than the possibility of a longer sentence. I couldn't handle the thought of sitting in court while his lawyer tried to make me look crazy or unreliable. The plea meant he'd go to prison for 3 years plus 5 years probation afterward. He'd have to register as a sex offender for life. The judge issued a permanent restraining order requiring him to stay at least 500 feet from me forever. When the prosecutor read the terms over the phone, I felt relieved. It was done. Finn would be locked up and everyone would know officially what he did. Fletcher's trial started exactly 3 months after his arrest. I had to testify about everything. The original stalking back in the city where he camped outside my house. The move here to escape him. The night he broke in and attacked me. Sitting in that courtroom with Fletcher 20 feet away was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. Savannah sat right behind me the whole time, and I kept glancing back at her for strength. Fletcher's lawyer tried to suggest I was paranoid because of my social media history. He implied I exaggerated the threat and that Fletcher was just an overeager fan. But the prosecutor had months of evidence showing Fletcher tracking my location after I moved. Photos of my house taken from different angles over weeks. The break-in itself captured on my phone. My testimony about him dragging me toward the door with his hand over my mouth. The bite mark on his finger that matched my dental records. The jury looked disgusted as the evidence piled up. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before coming back with guilty verdicts on all counts. Breaking and entering. Assault. Attempted kidnapping. Stalking across state lines. The judge scheduled sentencing for the following week. When we came back for that, the judge didn't hold back. He called Fletcher's behavior a calculated campaign of terror. He said Fletcher had systematically violated my safety and privacy over months, tracked me across state lines when I tried to escape, and then violently attacked me in my own home. The sentence was 7 years in prison. I sat there listening to the judge describe what Fletcher did, and I felt something shift inside me. Someone in authority was naming what happened, calling it what it was, saying out loud that I'd been terrorized and that it wasn't my fault. When it was over, Savannah walked me out of the courthouse and I cried in the parking lot. Not sad tears, relief tears. With both men locked up, I started sleeping better at night. But Esther warned me during our next session that healing wasn't going to be linear. Some days I felt strong and capable, ready to move on with my life. Other days I jumped at every sound and checked my locks 5 times before bed. She taught me grounding techniques for when the anxiety spiked. 5 things I could see, 4 things I could touch, 3 things I could hear, 2 things I could smell, 1 thing I could taste. It helped pull me back to the present when my brain started spinning with what-ifs and worst-case scenarios. She said the hypervigilance would decrease over time, but I needed to be patient with myself. Trauma changes your nervous system, and it takes a while for your body to believe you're actually safe now. Lucy showed up at my door 3 days later with a casserole and an apology. She said she felt terrible about defending Finn during my confrontation and wanted to make things right. I invited her in, and we sat at my kitchen table while she explained how she'd known Finn since he was a kid and never suspected anything dark beneath his helpful neighbor act. She started stopping by every week after that, sometimes with food, sometimes just to chat, always with invitations to neighborhood events I wasn't ready to attend yet. I appreciated her honesty about feeling responsible and her willingness to actually show up instead of just saying sorry once and disappearing. Having someone check on me regularly made the house feel less like a fortress and more like a home again. Kevin came over the following weekend with boxes of motion sensor lights and spent the entire Saturday installing them around my property. He showed me how each one worked, where the blind spots were, and how to adjust the sensitivity so I wouldn't get alerts every time a squirrel ran past. He programmed his cell number into my phone and told me to call anytime, day or night, if I felt unsafe or just needed someone to check on things. I tested the system that evening and watched the lights flood my yard when I walked outside, feeling a small bit of control return. Having neighbors who had my back instead of doubting me made such a huge difference in how secure I felt, like I wasn't fighting this battle completely alone anymore. The victim advocate connected me with a support group for stalking survivors that met every Tuesday evening at the community center. I was nervous walking into that first meeting, surrounded by strangers who knew what it felt like to be hunted. One woman named Sunshine shared her story about having two different stalkers over 5 years, and her advice about trusting myself while managing trauma responses hit hard. She talked about how the hypervigilance becomes a habit even after the threat is gone, and learning to distinguish between real danger and trauma reactions takes time and practice. I started attending every week, listening to stories that mirrored my own fears, and hearing strategies that actually worked for people further along in their healing. The group became a place where I didn't have to explain or justify my reactions, where everyone understood the exhaustion of constant vigilance. 3 months after both arrests, I was sitting in Esther's office when she asked me about my security camera habits. I realized I hadn't checked the footage obsessively in over a week, maybe longer. Before, I'd been reviewing every alert multiple times a day, watching for threats that weren't there anymore. Esther pointed out this was real progress, that I was learning to trust the systems I had in place instead of constantly monitoring for danger. She explained that my nervous system was slowly starting to believe I was actually safe, that the hypervigilance was decreasing as my body caught up with what my brain knew. I still had moments of panic when I heard unexpected noises, but they were getting less frequent and easier to manage with the grounding techniques she'd taught me. A letter arrived from Fletcher's prison with official stamps and warnings about the contents. The note inside said he wanted to apologize and ask forgiveness as part of some rehabilitation program the prison was running. I brought it to my next session with Esther, and we talked through whether reading his full apology would help or harm my healing process. She asked me what I needed from him to move forward, and I realized the answer was nothing. I didn't need his apology or his explanation or his attempt at making himself feel better about what he did. I returned the letter unopened with a note saying I didn't consent to any contact, and I felt powerful making that choice. 2 weeks later, another letter came, this time from Finn's family through their lawyer. His parents and sister wanted to participate in something called restorative justice, where they could understand what happened and take responsibility for not seeing the warning signs. The letter was careful and formal, emphasizing I had no obligation to meet with them, and they would respect whatever I decided. I discussed it with Esther and the prosecutor, both of whom said it was completely my choice, but that some victims found the process helpful. After thinking about it for several days, I agreed to one facilitated meeting with his parents and sister, but made it clear I would not meet with Finn himself. The restorative justice meeting happened in a neutral conference room with a trained facilitator present. Finn's mother cried through most of it, describing warning signs she'd missed over the years, and asking questions about what he'd done to me. His sister shared stories about previous girlfriends who'd complained about Finn being too intense, too possessive, too unwilling to accept rejection. Learning this pattern existed before me somehow made it feel less personal, like I wasn't uniquely broken or vulnerable. It didn't make what happened less violating, but it helped me understand I wasn't responsible for his obsession. His family apologized repeatedly and asked what they could do to support my healing, and I told them honestly that staying away and making sure Finn got real help in prison was enough. I started volunteering with a local organization that helped stalking victims navigate the legal system and access resources. Using my experience to help others felt powerful, like I was taking something terrible and creating something useful from it. The other volunteers included survivors who were years into their healing, and seeing them thrive gave me hope that I could get there too. I helped people fill out restraining order paperwork, connected them with victim advocates, and shared what worked for me during the worst periods. One woman told me that hearing my story made her feel less alone, and I understood exactly what she meant, because that's how I'd felt in the support group. 6 months after the arrests, I was sleeping through most nights without nightmares, and going entire days without thinking about either stalker. Esther said this was significant progress during our session, though she reminded me that anniversaries and triggers might bring symptoms back temporarily. I was learning to be patient with myself and celebrate small victories instead of beating myself up when I had bad days. The panic attacks were less frequent, the hypervigilance was manageable, and I was starting to imagine a future that wasn't defined by fear. Lucy invited me to her book club one afternoon, saying the women met monthly and would love to have me join them. I was nervous about being in a group of people who knew what happened, worried they'd treat me like a victim or ask invasive questions. But the women were kind and welcoming, talking about the current book selection and neighborhood gossip without pushing me to share my story. They clearly knew what had happened based on a few careful comments, but they let me be known for my opinions about books and my terrible jokes, instead of just being the woman who got stalked. I started attending every month, slowly rebuilding a social life in the neighborhood that felt normal instead of scary. At a follow-up meeting at the police station a few weeks later, Savannah walked into the conference room carrying a stack of files and mentioned she needed to check something with her dad before we started. I blinked at her and asked what she meant. She looked confused for a second, then laughed and explained that Kevin was her father. My jaw actually dropped because I'd been working with her for months and had no idea they were related. She said they kept their professional relationship separate, and Kevin never mentioned it because he wanted me to trust Savannah on her own merit, not because she was his daughter. That made sense, but I still felt shocked at the connection. Savannah then told me the real reason for the meeting. The police department wanted to use my case as a training example for officers learning to recognize stalking patterns. She asked if I'd be willing to speak to a group of officers about what helped and what didn't during the investigation. I thought about it for maybe 10 seconds before agreeing. If my nightmare could help other victims get better support, then something good would come from all of it. Savannah smiled and said the training was scheduled for next month, giving me time to prepare what I wanted to say. The day of the police training arrived faster than I expected. I stood in front of about 30 officers in a conference room at the station, my hands shaking as I held my notes. Savannah introduced me and then stepped back, letting me tell my story in my own words. I started with Fletcher, explaining how he'd stalked me in the city for months before I moved. Then I described Finn's behavior and how my trauma from Fletcher made me vulnerable to missing the warning signs at first. I emphasized how important it was that Savannah believed me right away when I reported everything, how she documented every detail and took my concerns seriously instead of dismissing them. Several officers took notes and asked really thoughtful questions about supporting victims better. One older officer raised his hand and admitted he didn't realize stalking could involve multiple people who didn't know each other. I explained how my original trauma actually made me a target for Finn, because I was isolated and vulnerable. That predators can sometimes sense when someone's already been victimized and see them as easier prey. The room got really quiet after that. Another officer asked what would have helped me feel safer earlier in the process. I told them about how the neighbors defended Finn initially, and how that made me doubt myself. How having just one person believe me would have changed everything. Savannah added that quick response time and thorough evidence collection made the prosecution's job much easier. By the end of the session, several officers came up to thank me and said they'd handle stalking cases differently now. A month after the police training, Kevin knocked on my door with a flyer about a neighborhood safety awareness event. The community was organizing it, and they wanted me to share my story publicly, so people could understand that stalking happens everywhere, even in small, quiet towns. My stomach twisted at the thought of standing in front of all my neighbors and talking about the worst time of my life. But I also knew it was important. People needed to understand the warning signs, and how to support victims instead of defending perpetrators. I told Kevin I'd do it, and he hugged me, saying how proud he was of my courage. The event was held in the community center on a Saturday afternoon. Lucy and Kevin stood on either side of me as I walked to the microphone, their presence making me feel less alone. I looked out at the crowd of maybe 50 neighbors and took a deep breath. Then I told them everything. About Fletcher tracking me from the city. About Finn's calculated stalking disguised as neighborly help. About how their initial defense of Finn made me feel crazy and alone. I explained the warning signs they should watch for and how to support someone who reports stalking instead of dismissing their concerns. My voice shook through parts of it, but I kept going. When I finished, the room was silent for a few seconds. Then people started clapping, and several neighbors came up afterward to thank me. One woman admitted she'd defended Finn that day I confronted him and apologized for not listening. Another neighbor said my story made him realize his daughter might be dealing with a stalker and he was going to talk to her. Lucy squeezed my hand and whispered that I'd just made the neighborhood safer for everyone. 2 weeks after the safety event, my phone rang with an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. A woman introduced herself as a journalist working on a series about stalking and community response. She'd heard about my case from someone at the police department and wanted to interview me. My first instinct was to say no, because the thought of my story being in print made me nervous. But she explained the article would focus on how communities can better support victims and recognize warning signs, using my experience as an example. She offered to keep me anonymous if I preferred. I told her I needed to think about it and discuss it with some people first. That afternoon, I called Esther and explained the situation. She asked what my gut was telling me, and I admitted that part of me wanted to do it because maybe it would help other victims. But another part was scared of losing my privacy and having people know my business. Esther reminded me that I could set boundaries about what I shared and that staying anonymous protected my identity. I also called Savannah to get her take on it. She said the journalist was legitimate and had done good work on victim advocacy issues before. She thought it could be valuable for raising awareness. After talking it through with both of them, I called the journalist back and agreed to the interview. We met at a coffee shop in the next town over where nobody knew me. She asked thoughtful questions and really listened to my answers instead of just looking for dramatic quotes. The article came out a month later and focused on community responsibility and supporting victims. Several people from the support group told me they'd read it and felt less alone. A thick envelope arrived in my mailbox one afternoon with an official state seal on it. I opened it standing right there by the mailbox and felt my stomach drop as I read the contents. Fletcher's parole hearing was scheduled in 5 years, and I had the right to submit a victim impact statement. 5 years felt both far away and way too close. The notification explained that my statement would be considered when the parole board decided whether to release him early. Even though the hearing was years away, knowing I'd have a voice in the decision gave me some control over the situation. I brought the paperwork to my next session with Esther, and we talked about what I wanted to say. She suggested I start drafting the statement now, even though I had plenty of time, because it would help me process the ongoing impact of Fletcher's actions. We spent the next few sessions working on it together. I documented how his stalking changed my entire life, how I still checked locks multiple times and couldn't fully relax in my own home, how I'd lost my social media career and had to rebuild my sense of safety from nothing. Esther helped me organize my thoughts and focus on concrete examples, instead of just emotional reactions. Writing it all down was harder than I expected because it forced me to really look at how much damage he'd caused. But it also felt powerful to name what he'd taken from me and demand that the parole board hear it. Another envelope showed up a few weeks later, this time from the state prison system. The return address made my hands shake as I held it. Inside was a letter from Finn sent through official prison channels. Unlike Fletcher's attempted contact that I'd returned unopened, I decided to read this one. But I called Esther first and asked if I could come to her office to open it with her there. She cleared time in her schedule that same day. I sat on her couch with the envelope in my lap, my heart pounding. Esther sat across from me and reminded me I could stop reading at any point if it became too much. I tore open the envelope and pulled out 3 handwritten pages. Finn's letter started with an apology for what he'd done to me. He said he was getting treatment in prison for his obsessive behaviors and was learning about why he'd acted that way. He claimed he never meant to hurt me, and that he genuinely thought we had a connection. Reading those words made my jaw clench because he was still making excuses. He talked about his mental health struggles like they justified stalking me and stealing my underwear. The apology seemed genuine in some parts, but then he'd slip into explaining why he did it, like his reasons made it okay. I put the letter down halfway through and looked at Esther. She asked what I was feeling, and I said I was frustrated because he still didn't fully get it. He was sorry he got caught and sorry he was in prison, but he wasn't really taking responsibility for terrorizing me. Esther nodded and said that was a common pattern with offenders who claim to be reformed. I finished reading the letter but decided not to respond. Esther suggested I keep it in my files in case it became relevant for future legal stuff. I folded it back up and stuck it in my bag, glad I hadn't read it alone. I'd been thinking about getting a dog for weeks. Something about having another presence in the house felt like it would help me feel safer. Lucy mentioned the local shelter had a German Shepherd mix who'd been trained in protection work but needed a home. I drove over there the next day to meet him. The dog was huge and alert, watching me carefully as the shelter worker brought him out. She explained he was 3 years old and had been trained by someone who couldn't keep him anymore due to housing issues. He knew basic commands plus some protection training. I knelt down and let him sniff my hand. His tail wagged slowly and he leaned into my touch. Something about him felt right. I filled out the adoption paperwork that same day and brought him home. Lucy came over to meet him and laughed when I told her his name. I'd decided to call him Clifford after the officer who'd helped arrest Finn. She said it was perfect, and that Clifford was probably the best security system I could ask for. Having him in the house changed everything. He slept by my bedroom door at night and followed me from room to room during the day. When I took him for walks, other people crossed the street because he looked intimidating even though he was gentle with me. The hypervigilance eased a bit knowing he'd alert me to any real threats. I started sleeping better almost immediately. 1 year after both arrests, I sat in Esther's office for what she called a progress check. She'd been tracking my symptoms and said I was doing well enough that we could reduce our sessions to every other week instead of weekly. My first reaction was panic because therapy had become my anchor. But she reminded me this was actually a sign of progress. I'd developed enough coping skills and support systems that I didn't need as much intensive help. She said healing wasn't about being fixed or never having bad days. It was about managing symptoms and building resilience to handle triggers when they came up. I could always increase the frequency again if I needed to. Sitting with that change felt scary, but also made me proud. A year ago, I was barely functioning, and now I was stable enough to space out therapy. Esther asked what felt different now compared to right after the arrests. I thought about it and realized I was sleeping through most nights, going entire days without thinking about either stalker and actually enjoying activities instead of just surviving them. The panic attacks still happened sometimes, but they were less frequent, and I knew how to work through them. I left her office that day feeling nervous about the change, but also genuinely proud of how far I'd come. The book club met at Lucy's house one month and she mentioned her friend's cousin was visiting from another town. He showed up halfway through the discussion and sat quietly in the corner, just listening. After the meeting ended, we started talking about the book, and I liked how he actually listened instead of just waiting for his turn to speak. He asked for my number before he left and I gave it to him, surprised at myself for being open to it. We texted for a few days before he asked me to coffee. On our third date, I knew I needed to tell him about the stalkers. We were walking Clifford through the park and I just came out with it. Told him about Fletcher and Finn and everything that happened. He stopped walking and looked at me with this expression I couldn't read. Then he asked really thoughtful questions about what would make me feel safe in a relationship. He wanted to know my boundaries around texting and showing up unannounced and sharing information about me with others. His respect for my trauma impressed me more than anything else could have. He didn't try to fix it or minimize it or treat me like I was broken. He just asked how to be a good partner given what I'd been through. I felt something shift in my chest, like maybe I could actually do this dating thing again. Kevin stopped by one afternoon while I was working in the garden with Clifford sprawled in the grass nearby. He mentioned that Finn's house had finally sold. A young couple with 2 kids bought it and were moving in next week. Relief washed over me knowing I wouldn't have to see that empty house across the street anymore. Kevin said he'd already talked to them about the neighborhood being security conscious after what happened. They were totally understanding and actually appreciated knowing the community took safety seriously. The new family moved in the following weekend and came over to introduce themselves. They had cameras installed and good locks on all their doors without me having to explain why it mattered. Their kids played in the yard and brought normal family energy to a space that had felt dark for so long. Watching them settle in made me realize how much had changed in a year. I had a dog, a boyfriend, a community that actually supported me, and neighbors who understood why security mattered. The trauma was still there and probably always would be, but it wasn't running my life anymore. My sister called me 3 weeks later asking if she could visit for the weekend. I hadn't seen her in almost 2 years because I pushed everyone away during the worst of the stalking. I was scared Fletcher or Finn might target my family if they knew about them. She drove up on Friday afternoon and pulled into my driveway while Clifford barked at the window. When I opened the door, she just stood there staring at me with tears in her eyes before pulling me into a hug. We spent the evening walking through the neighborhood with Clifford, and she kept commenting on how different I seemed. She met Kevin when he was outside watering his lawn, and Lucy when she came over with fresh cookies. My sister watched how they interacted with me, how natural and easy it felt, and she told me she was amazed by the community I'd built. That night, we sat on my back porch and talked about everything. I explained how the trauma made me withdraw from her because I was trying to protect her. She cried and said she understood, but it had hurt not being able to help me. We promised to stay closer going forward, and she made me swear I'd call her if anything ever felt wrong again. Before she left on Sunday, she hugged me tight and whispered that she was proud of how far I'd come. The following Tuesday, I went to my support group meeting like I did every week. The group leader pulled me aside before we started and asked if I'd be willing to co-facilitate the meetings. I was shocked because I still felt like I was figuring things out myself. She smiled and explained that I'd been attending for over a year, and newer members connected with my honesty about the hard parts. She said I didn't need to have everything figured out to be helpful. My willingness to share the messy parts of healing made me more effective than someone who pretended recovery was simple. I agreed even though my hands were shaking, and I spent the whole meeting worried I'd say something wrong. But afterward, 3 people thanked me for my insights, and one woman asked if we could grab coffee to talk more. I left feeling nervous, but also honored that my experience could help others. 2 months passed, and I was finally sleeping through most nights without checking the cameras. Then I got a call from the prosecutor saying Fletcher had filed an appeal claiming his trial was unfair. My stomach dropped, and all the progress I'd made felt like it disappeared instantly. I had to meet with the prosecutor to go over everything again. Every detail of the break-in and attack and months of being stalked in the city. Savannah came to the meeting and assured me the appeal was unlikely to succeed, given how strong the evidence was. But just the process of reliving it all triggered my anxiety in ways I hadn't felt in months. I started checking my locks multiple times again and watching the security footage obsessively. Esther helped me recognize I was falling back into old patterns, and we worked on coping skills to manage the stress. She taught me breathing exercises and ways to ground myself when the panic started rising. I practiced them every day, and slowly the hypervigilance started to ease again. The appeals court took 3 months to make their decision, and those months felt endless. Every day I woke up wondering if today would be the day I'd hear Fletcher was getting a new trial. Then Savannah called me on a Wednesday afternoon with the news. The appeals court had upheld Fletcher's conviction and sentence. I felt something lift off my chest that I didn't even realize I'd been carrying. Savannah explained that the failed appeal meant Fletcher would serve his full 7-year sentence without any possibility of early release. This security helped me start making longer-term plans without constantly worrying about when he'd get out. I could actually think about the future instead of just surviving day to day. My boyfriend took me out to dinner to celebrate, and I realized how much lighter I felt. A month later, my boss called me into her office, and I immediately panicked thinking I'd done something wrong. Instead, she told me I was promoted to a position with more responsibility and better pay. I sat there stunned as she explained all the reasons I'd earned it. Walking back to my desk, I had this moment where I realized this was the first major life decision I'd made, without considering how stalkers might use the information against me. I wasn't thinking about whether posting about it would make me a target, or if it would help someone find me. I was just excited about the opportunity. My boyfriend picked me up after work with flowers and told me he was proud of how far I'd come from the scared woman who couldn't leave her house alone. I looked at him and felt genuinely proud of myself for the first time in years. Lucy stopped by the next week with her grandson who was visiting from college. He asked if I'd be willing to speak at his high school about internet safety and stalking awareness. I was touched that Lucy trusted me with something so important, and I agreed immediately. The following month, I stood in front of 60 teenagers and told them my story. I expected them to be bored or distracted, but they were completely engaged. They asked smart questions about social media privacy and how to recognize when someone's behavior crosses from interest into obsession. Several students came up afterward to thank me for making these issues feel real instead of like some abstract danger. One girl told me her ex-boyfriend had been texting her constantly, and she hadn't known what to do until hearing me speak. I gave her information about resources and watched her walk away looking relieved to have a plan. 2 years after the arrests, I woke up one morning and realized I hadn't thought about either Fletcher or Finn in over a week. The security measures were still there, but they'd become habits instead of anxiety responses. I locked my doors because that's what people do, not because I was terrified someone would break in. I checked my cameras occasionally, but not obsessively. I enjoyed walking through my neighborhood with Clifford instead of viewing every outing as a potential threat. During my therapy session that week, Esther and I talked about this milestone. She acknowledged how far I'd come, but also reminded me that some level of caution was healthy and appropriate given what I'd been through. I didn't need to stop being aware of my surroundings to be healed. I just needed to find the balance between reasonable precaution and letting fear control my life. My boyfriend proposed 3 months later while we were having dinner at home. He got down on one knee right there in my kitchen and asked me to marry him. I said yes immediately. excited to build a future with someone who knew my whole story and loved me anyway. We started planning a small wedding in Lucy's backyard with just the neighbors who'd supported me through everything. Kevin offered to walk me down the aisle since my father had passed away years ago. I cried when he asked because it meant so much that this community had become family. We set the date for 6 months out, and I felt nothing but happiness when I thought about it. Then I got a letter in the mail from the state corrections department. Finn was released on parole after serving 2 years with good behavior. The notification confirmed the restraining order remained in effect and listed all the conditions of his release. My hands shook as I read through the details, and all the old fear came rushing back. I called Savannah immediately and she talked me through what the parole meant. Finn would be monitored closely, and any violation would send him straight back to prison. She explained the GPS monitoring and check-ins and all the restrictions on his movements. I increased my therapy sessions temporarily and leaned hard on my support system. My boyfriend stayed over every night that first week, and Kevin made a point of being outside whenever I left the house. The following week, I met with Finn's parole officer at her request. She wanted to assure me personally that they were taking his supervision seriously. She explained the conditions of his parole in detail, including GPS monitoring that would alert them if he came anywhere near my neighborhood. He was required to attend therapy twice a week and had restrictions on internet use and contact with women. Any violation of any condition would result in immediate arrest. She gave me her direct number and told me to call immediately if I saw him or felt unsafe for any reason. Knowing there were multiple layers of oversight helped me feel safer even though I was still cautious. I left her office feeling like maybe I could handle this after all. 3 months went by without incident and I started to relax into my new normal. Then the parole officer called me on a Tuesday morning while I was getting ready for work. She told me Finn had violated his parole by creating a fake social media account under a different name. The monitoring software caught it within 48 hours of him setting it up. He was arrested immediately and sent back to prison to serve his remaining sentence, plus an additional 18 months for the violation. I sat down on my bed and stared at my phone after she hung up. Savannah called me an hour later to check in and said this proved the system worked exactly as it should. The monitoring caught his behavior before he could use the account to contact anyone or escalate. She said my concerns about his patterns were completely justified, and the violation showed he hadn't actually changed. I felt this weird mix of vindication and exhaustion. Part of me wanted to celebrate that he was back behind bars, but another part was just tired of having to think about him at all. My boyfriend came home early from work when I texted him what happened. He held me while I cried, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of carrying this for so long. We ordered takeout and watched mindless TV and didn't talk about Finn for the rest of the night. The wedding planning became my focus after that, something positive to pour my energy into. We kept it small like we'd planned, just the neighbors and a few close friends in Lucy's backyard on a Saturday in June. Lucy cried during the entire ceremony, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief Kevin had given her. The officiant kept the vows simple and personal, and when my now husband slipped the ring on my finger, I felt this overwhelming sense of safety. Kevin walked me down the aisle like he'd promised, and his speech at the reception made everyone laugh until they cried. He told stories about me yelling at Finn on his lawn, and how he knew right then I was tougher than I looked. Savannah showed up in a gorgeous blue dress that made her look nothing like the detective I'd met during the worst night of my life. She hugged me and whispered that she was proud of how far I'd come. We danced under string lights Kevin had hung in the trees, and I looked around at all these people who'd fought for me and celebrated with me. The backyard where I'd once felt so unsafe was now filled with music and laughter and love. My husband pulled me close during a slow song, and I pressed my face against his shoulder, overwhelmed with gratitude for this life I'd built. We started house hunting a month after the wedding, wanting a place that was ours from the beginning. We found a house just a few streets over from my rental, still in the same neighborhood but far enough to feel like a fresh start. It had bright windows and a big fenced yard perfect for Clifford. We painted the walls in colors we chose together, yellow in the kitchen and soft green in the bedroom. The neighbors threw us a housewarming party and brought casseroles and welcomed us like family. I stood in our new living room surrounded by people and realized how much this community had embraced me. This wasn't the place I'd fled to in fear anymore. It was home. 6 months into married life, I got a call from a state representative's office asking if I'd be willing to consult on a bill about stalking laws and victim protections. They wanted me to share my experience with legislators and help shape policy. I met with them twice, explaining how Fletcher had tracked me across state lines and how Finn had operated right under everyone's noses for months. I talked about the gaps in the system and what had actually helped me stay safe. The bill passed 4 months later with provisions for better tracking of stalkers across jurisdictions and mandatory GPS monitoring for all convicted stalkers. Knowing my nightmare had contributed to protecting other people gave me this sense of purpose I hadn't expected. The representative sent me a copy of the signed bill, and I framed it in our hallway. Fletcher's 5-year parole hearing came up that fall, and I had to submit my impact statement. I spent weeks writing it with Esther's help, documenting how his actions still affected my daily life. My husband took the day off work to go with me to the hearing. We sat in the back of the room while Fletcher's lawyer argued he'd been a model prisoner and deserved early release. Then Savannah testified about his continued refusal to take responsibility or show genuine remorse. She presented documentation of disciplinary issues and his insistence that I'd overreacted to his attention. The parole board denied his request after deliberating for 20 minutes. He'd serve his full 7-year sentence. I felt my husband squeeze my hand, and this wave of relief washed over me. I had at least 2 more years before I'd have to think about Fletcher walking free. We went out for dinner afterward and didn't talk about the hearing at all. Just made plans for our anniversary trip. 3 years after the arrests, I realized during a therapy session with Esther that I was actually thriving. I had a career I loved in victim advocacy, a marriage built on trust and real communication, a community that supported me, and tools to manage my trauma responses when they showed up. Esther suggested we transition to monthly check-ins instead of weekly since I was doing so well. I felt nervous about it, but also proud. She reminded me I could always increase frequency if I needed to, that healing wasn't linear, and I shouldn't feel bad about needing more support sometimes. I left her office that day feeling capable in a way I hadn't in years. The invitation to speak at a national conference on stalking and victim advocacy arrived in my email on a random Tuesday. They wanted me to share my story with law enforcement, prosecutors, victim advocates, and therapists from across the country. I accepted and spent months preparing my talk with Esther's guidance. The conference was in Chicago, and my husband came with me for support. I stood on that stage in front of 300 professionals and told them everything. About Fletcher and Finn, about the neighbors who defended my stalker, about Savannah who believed me, about learning to trust myself again. The audience was silent during my talk, and several people approached me afterward with tears in their eyes. A prosecutor from California told me my story would change how she works with victims. A detective from Texas asked if he could use my case in his department's training. I felt honored to use my experience to create change in the system. Lucy passed away peacefully in her sleep at 87, just a few weeks after my conference speech. Her family called me and asked if I'd speak at her funeral. I stood at the podium in the church and told everyone how she'd become the grandmother I needed when I needed her most. How she'd defended Finn at first, but then showed up for me every single day after the truth came out. How she'd taught me that people can change and grow, that mistakes don't define us if we're willing to make them right. Her daughter hugged me afterward and said Lucy had talked about me constantly, so proud of my strength and growth. I planted a rose bush in Lucy's memory in our front yard where she used to garden. Every spring when it blooms, I think about her sitting on her porch watching over the neighborhood. 5 years after everything began, I found out I was pregnant. I stared at the positive test in our bathroom and felt excited instead of terrified. My husband came home from work and I showed him the test, and we both cried happy tears. We talked about safety measures that night, calmly and rationally, installing a few additional cameras and updating our security system. But fear didn't dominate our choices. We focused on preparing the nursery and picking out names and reading parenting books. Esther congratulated me during our monthly session and said this was a huge milestone. I'd reached a place where I could embrace joy without trauma controlling my decisions. I could bring a baby into the world and believe we'd be safe. Fletcher was released after serving his full 7-year sentence, and the notification arrived in my mailbox on a Thursday. I opened it while my husband made dinner and read through all the details. The restraining order was permanent. He was required to register as a sex offender, and Savannah had already called to assure me he'd be monitored closely. I felt my heart rate increase, but I didn't panic. I didn't spiral into hypervigilance or obsessively check the cameras. My husband and I reviewed our security measures that evening, made sure everything was updated and working, and then we focused on preparing for our baby. Fletcher no longer had power over my daily existence. I'd built a life so full and secure that he was just a name on a piece of paper, a person from my past who couldn't touch my present. We went to a prenatal appointment the next day and heard our baby's heartbeat, and I felt nothing but hope for the future. A few weeks later, Kevin knocked on my door with an idea about starting a neighborhood watch program. He wanted my help designing it since I understood what actually helps victims versus what just makes people feel safer. We gathered the new neighbors and several longtime residents in Lucy's old house, which her family let us use for meetings. I brought printed materials about recognizing stalking behaviors, supporting victims without making them feel blamed, and working with police effectively. Kevin took notes while I explained how Fletcher tracked me across state lines and how Finn manipulated community trust to access my home. The group asked smart questions about warning signs and how to balance vigilance with respecting privacy. We set up a phone tree, created patrol schedules, and established clear protocols for reporting suspicious activity to Savannah's department. 3 other neighborhoods contacted Kevin after hearing about our program, asking if we could help them set up similar systems. I met with their planning committees and shared templates for training sessions and response procedures. Watching our model spread to protect other vulnerable people felt like taking something horrible and building something useful from it. My contractions started at 2 a.m. about 6 weeks after we launched the watch program. My husband drove me to the hospital while Kevin and his wife followed behind us, ready to help with anything we needed. Labor lasted 14 hours, and I held my husband's hand through every contraction, focusing on the life we were bringing into our safe home instead of the fear I used to carry everywhere. When the nurse finally placed my daughter on my chest, I started crying and couldn't stop. We named her Lucy after the neighbor who defended Finn at first, but then showed up for me every single day once she knew the truth. Holding Lucy in our bedroom, surrounded by my husband, Kevin and his wife, and the friends who fought for me, I felt grateful for everything I built after the trauma tried to destroy me. Some days are still hard and probably always will be, But healing isn't about erasing what happened. It's about refusing to let the past control my future, and sitting here with my daughter proves that surviving can turn into actually thriving.